What up? What up? I'm just watching in the background this horrible weather that the East Coast is getting. And, you talk about the federal government playing a role, and there's been states of emergencies declared on the East Coast in many states. And, the federal government, after this ultimately uh, subsides, will have to make a decision on whether or not, well, get out of here. Um, Whether or not a federal agency such as the FEMA, Federal Emergency and Management Agency, will go in and provide financial assistance and services for the citizens of those states. So, every time I turn on the TV, I am instantly making connections to our curriculum and the powers that the federal government has. The focus of this lecture is principles of the Constitution. How do we change what the Constitution means? How do we change the interpretation of the different aspects of the Constitution? There are two ways to do that: informal and formal ways of doing it. More often than not, we use the informal manners in which to change the meaning of various aspects of the Constitution. The reason for that is it's a lot easier. Uh, you don't need a formal amendment. And I think in all the classes I talked explicitly, either today or yesterday, in regards to the process of formally amending the Constitution, which we'll briefly discuss at the end of this screenshot or screencast. You are getting a screenshot. Uh, there are various ways in which you can informally change the Constitution, and different branches of government exercise these frequently. The elastic clause, or the necessary and proper clause, was put in the Constitution, I think, purposefully, to allow Congress specifically, mostly, uh, to have a lot of flexibility in carrying out their enumerated or expressed powers. So the powers that are explicitly listed in the Constitution. One of those powers is the ability to tax. Obviously, we know with the Articles of Confederation that taxation, or the issue of taxation, was a paramount issue that they had to address in the structure of this new, stronger federal government. So they had the elastic clause, and it certainly isn't just tied to taxation, it's tied to any of the enumerated powers in the Constitution. But it allows Congress, I'm looking for the right word, I apologize, but it allows them to, oh man, I guess it's been a long week of Friday night, but it allows them to use various vehicles. We'll use the term vehicle, various vehicles in which to carry out the powers that are explicit in the Constitution. So, for example, the Affordable Care Act was a piece of legislation passed by Congress that basically forces citizens to have health insurance. And we could get into a big discussion about the rationale for that. But their justification of being able to force citizens to have health insurance was the idea that if you don't, it's a penalty that you have to pay to the government. And the courts ruled that that penalty is essentially a tax, so that Congress could initiate this piece of legislation. They have to be able to have justification for forcing people to have health care. Well, if they're allowed to tax people, well, I guess, and this is maybe a stretch for some people, I guess a penalty, a financial penalty, is equivalent to a tax. So the elastic clause was certainly in play when the courts ruled that the Affordable Care Act was constitutional because it was tied to a specific power that the federal government had, which is taxation. Very controversial decision. We will certainly talk about this in greater detail later. But another example, of course, I gave in class is the idea that Congress has the ability to tax, again, taxation. It is rational for them to say that they have the ability to start a government entity under the executive branch called the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. The ability to make citizens file every year an accounting of what money they made, what money they paid out. You'll get into all this when you get older and have real jobs, but as long as the government, the federal government, can tie what they're doing to a specific power in the Constitution, they're usually able to do it via the elastic clause or the necessary and proper clause. So it's very necessary that they have an agency like the IRS to carry out an enumerated power of taxation in this case. Judicial review, goodness gracious. Oftentimes, this is one of the most powerful ways to kind of figure out or interpret what the framers meant when they put a specific provision into the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. So you can go case by case by case. I love Texas versus Johnson, not because I love burning the flag, but because it deals with freedom of speech, one of the hallmarks of our democracy. And so when the court ruled that individuals could protest against the government or the presidency by burning a flag, they're further defining what freedom of speech means. Obviously, when you burn a flag, you're not speaking, it's symbolic. But what the courts determined, the Supreme Court determined, and I think this is mid-'80s, is that you have the ability to silently speak, if you will, and it's protected by the First Amendment. So with every decision the court makes, they are further defining what pieces of the Constitution mean in regards to the role of government and in regards to your rights of citizens in this democracy. Judicial review, established by Marbury Madison, and certainly one of the more significant informal powers of our government. Presidential actions, we certainly talked this week about President Obama's immigration executive order. These are used more frequently by the executive branch, and I should probably put that in bold, more than anything else. And the idea that the president makes executive orders, in this case with immigration, further defining just how citizens can become naturalized. In this case, they don't automatically become naturalized, but they're not deported. And even more so, that it kind of defines the power of Congress. Now, as we know, and as I mentioned, the judicial branch is going to be making a determination in this regard shortly this year in regards to whether the president went too far with his immigration executive order. Customs and traditions, these are things that are not mentioned in the Constitution, but just kind of come about. Political parties kind of just evolve. The presidential cabinet, the different departments, Department of the Interior, Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, these make sense. And it's hard to argue when the president is carrying out laws or the executive branch are carrying out laws that they have to have some vehicle to carry them out. So very rarely challenged in the courts. And the whole idea is the Constitution is a living document. I don't know if this is what the framers intended, but I think they wrote the Constitution in a rather vague way to add flexibility for a changing America. I love that term. When they passed this Constitution, they probably had no idea some of the issues that would evolve hundreds of years later. So I don't know if they intentionally did it, but this is kind of how it's evolved, that the Constitution is flexible. And some individuals don't like that. For example, the NRA, National Rifle Association, they want their people, their citizens, to be able to have guns in any regard. They will look at the Constitution and says that you have the right to bear arms, and the government shouldn't restrict that. Well, ultimately, it's up to the courts to determine whether or not the government has gone too far, in this case, in restricting your right to have a handgun. So we'll never know what the framers truly intended in regards to how flexible this document was, but it's become very flexible because of these informal ways of changing the Constitution. Now, formally is a process, and I'm just going to skip this here and go right to the chart. Formally is a way in which Congress can change this Constitution rather easily. And in this regard, you have the two steps, or the steps in the process. You have the national step, which is a 2/3 step, which you'll see on the left here, in regards to proposing an amendment or changing the actual wording of the Constitution. Not easy to do unless you have an overwhelming majority of both chambers of Congress. And as I mentioned earlier, this usually means that you have to have an issue that both Democrats and Republicans will agree upon. All of the 17 amendments that have occurred after the passage of the Constitution have taken this 2/3 step route. Then it goes to the states, and you need a 3/4 or 75% vote of the states, 38 out of 50. Very, very difficult to do. And I'm going to focus on this because this is the manner, the vehicle in which these 17 amendments that have occurred have been ratified. And so, again, you have the national step, you have the state step, and it doesn't happen very often. It's a very, very ironclad process, meaning that we are going to be sure, absolutely positive, that this is a good change to the Constitution, because you're changing the written words, you're adding to it. And it's the beauty of our Constitution that you have this flexibility with informally changing, and then when you're very sure that we need to make a change, you have the formal method. So the framers put these avenues, these ways in which you can change the meaning of the document in, and it's really ingenious whether they meant to do it or not. Peace.